We have been looking at basic communication skills that create an environment in which good rapport and meaningful change are possible. There are, however, additional skills and information that might make the process of helping another person more understandable and give us a more realistic picture of how people grow and change. In 2002, William Miller and Stephen Rolnick wrote a book that changed the way many people approach their clients. The book, Motivational Interviewing, was written primarily for therapists working with individuals in the field of addiction. I would highly recommend that you read this book if you are going into the addictions field. This presentation will summarize the stages of change and briefly describe motivational interviewing. It is covered in Chapter 12 in your textbook. What is change? Change means different things to different people. Sometimes change can mean immediate change, let's say to painful circumstances. It can mean long-term changes to affect well-being and confidence. Or change can involve giving up old ways and old habits. Change usually involves commitment and hard work. Change does not usually happen quickly, so it is best to view it as a process of change. Thinking about change as a process, there are many things that are obstacles to change and things that are aids to change. Using the slide, if you were to need to make a change, think about those things that are obstacles for you and those things that help you to make the change. Some obstacles might include fear, uncertainty, stubbornness, denial, lack of confidence, lack of hope, inability to envision a different future, procrastination, and so forth. The things that help you make the change may include your support system, your workout buddy, the right equipment, professional help such as counselors or dietitians, motivation, skills, hope, and knowledge. There are several well-known stages of change. These were developed by DiClemente and Prochaska when they were working with folks who were trying to quit smoking. And they discovered these stages of change, which have become refined and now are established into these 5 steps. There's pre-contemplation. The person in pre-contemplation is not really thinking about change at all and is not ready to change. They don't even really see a need to make a change. Listen to why the person is reluctant to change. Explore the obstacles. Be matter-of-fact without passing judgment. Contemplation. In this stage, the person is willing to explore, but not ready to commit to change. You may hear ambivalence or going back and forth about making any changes. Reflect back the ambivalence that you are hearing. Preparation stage. At this stage, the person is ready to change, but needs a plan. Now is a good time to brainstorm. Make an initial plan with baby steps so that the client can begin to make the changes necessary to lead to more extensive changes. Action. Action is when the person is actually making the changes, no matter how small. This includes new ways of thinking and doing things. Use your reflective listening to hear any concerns about the new changes that the client is making. Maintenance. In this final stage, the person is seeking to make the change a permanent part of life. Your support and encouragement are crucial at this stage of change. The reality of change is like a spiral, and sometimes it feels like you're going backwards. The stages are not necessarily linear, and if you have different problems or issues, will have different stages of change. So an example of this is maybe I have several problems. I have smoking, meth use, marijuana, and depression. And my different stages of change, you assess me and you discover that for making a change about my smoking or quitting smoking, I'm in pre-contemplation. I don't even see a problem with that. However, for quitting methamphetamine, I'm in action stage. I actually have begun attending some NA meetings because, of course, the court told me or whatever. For quitting marijuana, contemplation. I can see some connection. I'm considering some change, but I'm not quite sure. And depression, and maybe still be at pre-contemplation. I'm not even sure I see that as a problem. You as the counselor will need to figure out where the person is at. You will assess the readiness to change for each of the problems that have been presented. The goal is to move the client through the stages of change, one stage at a time. If your client comes in, let's say court-ordered into treatment, but really sees no need to change because they just wanted to get out of jail anyways, your goal as the counselor would be to move the client from pre-contemplation to contemplation. And then eventually we would move them from contemplation to preparation. It is very helpful to think about the stages of change and to assess each problem for the stage of change. In the Files menu on the left-hand side, navigational menu, under Handouts, there are several packets for motivational interviewing, also known as MI. In addition, you will find several handouts for the interventions that we will be discussing shortly. If you ask the client, how likely are you to make a change in the next 6 months, and they indicate somewhat likely, this means they are at least at the contemplation stage. If the answer to the question was not likely at all, I don't see a need to change, then this is pre-contemplation. Ask the follow-up question, what are you willing to do at this time? This will give you a sense of the difference between contemplation and preparation or action. Let's say the client ends up saying, I've been thinking about this for quite a while, and I already have the exercise equipment, so I know I can start walking on the treadmill tomorrow. This is an indication that the client is ready for action. The stages of change is a theoretical perspective that we can use to understand where a person is coming from in terms of their substance use and other mental health problems. At the top in blue is the first stage called pre-contemplation. At this stage, as we mentioned, people do not see a problem with their use and are not even considering a change. The stages that follow are contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, and recurrence. Contemplation is a stage that we strive to move patients to if they are at risk for substance use-related problems. Patients in the contemplation stage can see the possibility of change, but they are ambivalent about changing. The preparation stage is where we begin to identify the strategies for change, and action is where the changes are actually taking place. Maintenance is where the patients have achieved their goal and are working to maintain their new behaviors. Recurrence is when patients may relapse or go back to their old behaviors. Recurrence can be part of the process of changing. Please note, each of the stages has a primary task associated with it for the counselor or case manager. Your assessment of the client's stage of change will lead to the appropriate stage of intervention for you to take. The chart above shows what strategies we can employ with patients at the different stages of readiness to change. If we look at the first two stages, which are the most relevant and common for people engaging in at-risk levels of substance use, then we can see that our goals are just to offer information or feedback, explore the meaning of events, explore the pros and cons of substance use, and build self-efficacy. Patients may not be ready to make a change at the time of this brief intervention. However, they may be willing to explore the pros and cons of their use or track their levels of use to see if they may have a more significant problem than they realized. By linking the intervention to where they are in the stages of change, we can help to move them forward to the next stage and increase the likelihood that they will take action. If we get ahead of the clients, for example, ask them to take action before they have even identified that they have a problem, we are likely to stimulate resistance. An example of this: you are working with a first-time DUI offender who does not believe that he has a problem with drinking and sees no need to change. After all, it's all about the money. Clearly, the client is in pre-contemplation. But your intervention is to say, well, what you need to do is attend 90 Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in 90 days. This is a mismatch of the intervention to the stage of change for the client. Your intervention of 90 meetings is more appropriate for someone in the action stage, not in the pre-contemplation stage. Relapse. The definition is a return to the old addiction, also known as recurrence on the previous slides. In a relapse, we need to identify the triggers. What happened? What thoughts, feelings, behaviors, friends, environments, circumstances led to the relapse? Triggers can be both positive and negative. Change talk definition. Asking the person to tell you how things could be better if certain changes were made. Sometimes this is the intervention for ambivalence, reflective listening to explore with the client. What many people see as resistance is often ambivalence. Ambivalence is a normal reaction to change. It stipulates that the client who decides whether or not change will take place. Come alongside the person and do not confront the resistance or ambivalence head on. Instead, come along the side and ask, what are you willing to try at this point? Motivational interviewing is about encouragement, sometimes known as a softer theory to break through denial. Here are some examples of the communication skills that facilitate change in motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing involves the following 4 techniques. It is signified by the word OARS, O-A-R-S. O for open questions. We have already covered open questions, so you are familiar with those. Affirm. Building self-esteem, showing respect, and getting a winning streak going. Focus on the positives. Reflect. Using your reflective listening, empathy, and skill building. Summarize. Close out on good terms. Gather the conversation together, summarize what has been accomplished, and close out on good terms. All of these skills we just covered in the last few chapters. Open questions, reflective listening, and summarizing, and even affirming. Putting them all together, you get motivational interviewing. What not to do in motivational interviewing. Sometimes case managers hear ambivalence and decide it is resistant, and they begin getting negative and down on the client who is not making the changes. This is the opposite of motivational interviewing. We talked about summarizing. There are many times when you can use summarizing or summaries. Collecting summaries, pulling together the important points that you have heard so far. Sometimes linking, making points that you made earlier and tend to bring them back into awareness. That's linking summaries. Summarization can help you out many times when you feel stuck with a client. And as I mentioned earlier, summarizing is one of the most underutilized helpful skills in counseling and case management. When your client is argumentative and reluctant and they argues against change, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily dead set against it. Instead, you as the counselor shift the discussion to what change would look like and focus on change instead. We're going to go through some of those interventions that you saw on the earlier slide where the stage of change was matched with different interventions. When I say the word interventions, those are techniques. If you look in the handouts in the Files menu on the left-hand side, under Handouts, you will see that there are several handouts specific to different types of interventions. As mentioned, interventions are techniques. Interventions is what the counselor or case manager does during the session. So the way the process works is you would first do your stage of change assessment. What stage of change is this person at? Then use motivational interviewing skills, your ORs, and then finally use an appropriate intervention matched to that stage of change. So as we saw on the previous slide as well, here they are. In the pre-contemplation stage, some of the interventions may be just providing education and doing the pros and cons exercise. In the handouts menu, again on the left-hand side, you will see all of these exercises have handouts in them, so you can go ahead and print those out. In addition, it will be helpful to consider which stage of change your client is at. You should have already made up, your client's name, some basic information when we did the referral form. You should also have made up the issues and the referrals that you were planning to make for your client. Now think about what stage of change is your client going to be at. And then once you know the stage of change of your client, then you will know the interventions that you are going to make. And this week you will begin to learn how to write up progress notes. And progress notes is where you will document your interventions and also the client's response to the interventions. The assignment for this week is to write up 5 progress notes and to turn them in by Sunday at midnight for 25 points. You get 5 points for each progress note, up to 25 points as you turn them in. So some of these interventions, if you decide that your client is at the preparation stage, you may want to pull out the handout on a change plan and also the social support circles, and maybe do 2 sessions, since there's 2 interventions, do 2 sessions on each of those. Remember, you need 5 progress notes. So under pre-contemplation, the worker's task, if your client is at pre-contemplation, your task or your intervention is to raise doubt about the client continuing in their behavior. You need to build rapport with the client. Provide education about negative consequences. So let's say your client has a alcohol use disorder and they're in pre-contemplation, so that first-time DUI offender maybe that we talked about. You would be providing education about negative consequences. And so your interventions could take a lot of different forms about that. You could hand them brochures, you could read some articles and research about alcohol use and consequences, and that would be your intervention. You're going to get to know the client and what's important to be able to reinforce that later and find the strengths in the client that you can help them use those strengths to begin to make some changes. Remember, we're talking about small changes. All we want to see is the client to go from pre-contemplation to contemplation. Pre-contemplation interventions happen during the session, and so you would be talking about either providing education or the pros and cons exercise. If you look in one of the motivational interviewing handouts, you will see the pros and cons exercise. For the stage of contemplation, your work or task is to tip the balance. So you remember, contemplation is about ambivalence. I want to, but I don't want to change. And so tipping the balance means you're exploring reasons, you're trying to get them to tip the balance toward the side that wants to change. You will explore the reasons to change and the risks for not changing. You're going to explore the ambivalence, going back and forth. You can use a pros and cons exercise, and you can also, in contemplation, use a values exploration activity. The values exercise in the handouts, you'll see that there's a list of personal values, and you would have the client work through the handout and circle, let's say, their top 5 values. And let's say they value family as number 1. That's my top priority. And then you would gently confront or share about the discrepancy. Well, when you go to the bars after work every day because you're stressed out, how does that match up with your value of spending time with your family? And again, it's not an angry confrontation, it's just a pointing out of the discrepancy. There is a readiness to change scale in one of the handouts, so generally it's from 0 to 10. 10 means you're definitely going to make a change. 0 means you're definitely not going to make the change. And you ask the client to pinpoint on this readiness to change scale where they're at today. In the preparation stage, the client really is ready for some brainstorming. So you want to clarify the client's own goals and strategies for change, and offer them a menu of options for change. Any barriers that they might perceive, you want to explore those. So maybe they don't have childcare, or their work schedule is a problem, etc. And so you want to lower those barriers to change. Help the client enlist their social support. There's a really nice exercise where it has social support circles, and what they do is in the very center you put the client's name in that very center circle, and you say, how many other people can you depend upon to help you make this change? And then they list down who it is, and the idea is to get that all of those circles filled in more and more and more as they begin to prepare to make changes. So take a look at that social support handout and develop a change plan. There's also a handout for developing a change plan, which involves setting specific goals and the specific agreements to make the change. In the action stage, of course, the client has already made steps towards change. And so your focus is going to be to keep that plan going, remove any barriers that may pop up, problem solve, and reward and recognize progress, which is really super important. Remember that change, any kind of behavior change, takes hard work and commitment. And so a couple of things that you might do during the action stage is to really look at triggers and their response and how they were able to handle it. Reinforcement of the progress could be things like keeping a calendar of every day that they didn't drink any alcohol with a little gold sticker or gold star. Again, counting the days. There's a really great app on called NoMo, NoMo, and it actually tracks the number of days that you don't drink, the amount of money that you save, and the amount of time that you have gained by not drinking. Anyway, those kinds of reinforcement tools are really great interventions at the action stage. At the maintenance stage, which really your client has now made the change for a long period of time, and usually 6 months or more, and your stage of helping them at this point is to develop a fire escape plan if it's needed, how to prevent a relapse. Your interventions also include affirming the client and reviewing long-term goals with the clients and support their newly established lifestyle changes. Your assignment for this week is to write up 5 progress notes on sessions that you have conducted with your client. You will get 5 points per progress note, up to a maximum of 25 points. You will see the assignment on progress notes in the next module on the Canvas. You will need the progress notes template that is attached. It's also located in the Files menu on the left-hand side under Forms. You will also need, under the Handouts on the File menu, the Abbreviations form, and you can use standard abbreviations in your progress notes. The third person means counselor conducted a pros and cons exercise with the client. Counselor used reflective listening during the exercise to ensure the client felt listened to and understood. The counselor focused on the client towards the cons of continuing to use methamphetamine. Counselor assigned homework for the next week to journal about any negative consequences to the use of methamphetamine during the next week. In other words, you're writing about yourself as you're conducting the interventions in the third person. Progress notes are the meat of your documentation. Do not skimp in your documentation. Write full sentences. The magic number is always 3. A minimum of 3 sentences would be acceptable in each section of the progress note. Use formal clinical language rather than commonplace language, and focus on the facts or observable behaviors, not your opinions. Your progress notes should be individualized. Use the client's name. Use quotation marks to indicate exactly what the client said, which then individualizes the progress note even more. Be specific and detailed in your description of the session. For example, rather than saying, "Client stated they are doing well in recovery and he attends meetings regularly. Client is testing negative." This sentence will end up sounding like every other client you are writing about. Instead, write, "John stated that he is doing well in recovery because his, quote, relationship with his wife has improved communication," unquote. John also reported that he is attending 3 AA meetings per week. One is the men's group, which he feels is helping to improve his relationship. Case manager observed that John smiled more during the session and appeared happier with his recovery. The more detail you add, the more the client comes alive in your documentation. Remember, documentation is highly confidential, so you can be detailed in describing the client's response and reactions. Focus on the session is a brief description of the overall session. For example, you may write, focus. The focus of this individual session was to check on the client's ongoing recovery status. Intervention is what the counselor or case manager did during this session. List as many interventions as you can think of that you did. See the handout of interventions using complete sentences. Client's response is tied to each of the interventions that you conducted and wrote up in the intervention section. So if there's 3 interventions were conducted, then there would probably be 3 responses. Use complete sentences, use quotes and observations, factual information, and behaviors to describe the client's response. Progress and plan is what you will follow up on at the next session. Also write down when the next session is scheduled, both the date and the time. For example, plan. Counselor will follow up on homework assigned, client to journal about his positive changes in his relationship related to his success in recovery. Next session is Tuesday, January 12th at 1:30. Remember to drug test the client. When it is time for your client to return to see you, you can review just the progress and plan section, the P part, of the previous progress note to remind yourself of what you were working on with the client. It provides continuity of care between the sessions. A single location to review when you are preparing for the session. Good luck on submitting your progress notes.